Yeah, so thank you very much for those who have made it in time to participate in this brief webinar, which is basically meant to validate the Innovation Outlook report for Kenya. My name is Johannes Teller. I am the convener of a huge network of researchers and policymakers across Africa called the Africa Research and Impact Network, the ARIN in short. And ARIN brings together about 200 researchers and policymakers from about 36 African countries. And what we do at ARIN is to basically leverage lessons on best research and impact practices. As you're aware that in Africa, there's so many things, a lot of research that has been done, and a lot of research projects that continue to emerge. We have never stopped to reflect and think about how do we leverage some of the best practices to be able to inform transformative policies. So the focus of the ARIN learning and the engagement processes is basically on some of the areas that have been identified by the African Union through the Agenda 2063 as critical for the transition of Africa to sustainable industrial economy. So these are sectors to do with, themes or areas around, agriculture and land use, science, technology, and innovation, which is part of what we are trying to do here, but also issues to do with climate change, disaster risk management, which are really pertinent in the development or pursuit of Africa, as we've seen also from COVID. So the ARIN network was actually funded by the Foreign Commonwealth Development Office, that's FCDO, through their East Africa hub, to be able to develop the first kind of inaugural outlook study, which then could form a basis for the subsequent studies. And this study has been undertaken in close consultation or in close collaboration with the Kenyan Innovation Agency, which is basically the dedicated innovation agency mandated to catalyze innovation and support some of these transformative policies. So the report we want to present today is relatively more of a framework, a template that really subsequent interventions or studies that improve how we look at the country's innovation could build on. The study has been basically built on a relatively consultative process where we had a national working group that drew membership from different sectors. We had the expert reviewers, but also we had the wider STI stakeholders who have been consulted and have been brought on board in terms of validating some of the initial findings, indicators that were developed from this particular report. So we're gonna give you a bit of the background and some concepts in terms of how we define innovations, and then a bit of the methodology, how we approach the whole process, and then the outlook itself, which is more of a, looking at the various sectors. Innovation is wide, and also the indicators that could be used to show, how the Kenyan innovation outlook is actually looking like, how the status and some kind of progress on different domains or different aspects that relate to innovation. Then we're gonna just show you a bit of the scoreboard, which is now a menu of indicators that are could be used to measure or could be used to track different elements of innovation, and then give you our conclusions and next steps. So starting from the background, the first question we ask is, why is it important to have an innovation outlook for Kenya? Yeah, I mean, everyone can ask that question. And because there's a lot of innovation studies, there's a lot of surveys, startup surveys, incubation hub surveys, university surveys. So somebody might ask, why do you need an outlook? Number one is that an outlook is important because it could provide an integrated framework for effective governance of innovation activities. And when we talk about governance here, we are talking about the different sectors or the different agencies that are actually mandated to drive innovation in Kenya. at the moment, there isn't a very well consolidated way in which, even Kenya can have a kind of a bird's eye view or a way of, bringing all the activities and the different agencies and the responsibilities that they play together. So that is a major gap that an outlook enables you to see innovation in a country in its totality. It provides kind of surveillance tool for identifying niches for strategic investments and economic growth. So this is very important because we don't know really what are the opportunities for investments. If today you are an expert, you're a government agency or any other institution working on innovation, and a donor comes to you and say, okay, I have some 100 billion or $100 million. I want to invest in a particular innovative idea, which could then provide some good returns to the economy, create jobs and all that. You realize that most people will blabber and start thinking about, okay, let me go and consult the university chancellor somewhere. Okay, let me go and consult. Yet these are things we've been doing. So there hasn't been that framework that can really help to track how the innovation activities are happening, what are the opportunities, what are the impacts that we see, and how can those particular impacts be used to make decisions in terms of investment. And that is why an outlook that we are trying to develop here is basically bringing out indicators as well that can be used to basically track and monitor interventions. A learning and feedback framework that shows innovation opportunities, gaps, and challenges, very important, simply because there is a lot going on. As I've said in the beginning, a lot of innovation studies, research, actions, businesses, hubs, and for a while it has not been clear in terms of what lessons as a country have we learned. How can we inform, the decision? So how can we basically, look? We actually focused or we aimed to, inform the key agencies that are engaged in innovation, and of course other stakeholders, of course including the donors and all that, on potential opportunities and trends, and of course the wider governance of innovation. And so in developing this outlook, what processes did we apply? Of course, when you develop an outlook is a very complex thing. And I always tell people, as we were going through this study, I used to tell people that an outlook is not a certain survey. You go and do a survey, draw graphs, and an outlook is something that needs a lot of conceptualization. So these particular steps really were very important for us as we were developing this particular outlook, that we had to define really what is it that we want to see as innovation in the Kenyan context. Of course, building from the broader innovation definitions that we know. What is the conceptual framework that speaks to the innovation situation in Kenya? So we had to develop a conceptual framework, validate it through consultation with the ministry, ministries, the Kenya, the different agencies that are involved, and also different stakeholders. We then use that framework to begin to collect information based on the different components of that particular framework, and analyze the information, collect some quantitative data, work with stakeholders to be able to define, based on those components of the framework, how can we develop certain indicators that reflect or can define the progress in the various domains, so the various components of innovation, and then based on that, refine those indicators, get some values for those indicators, and show like a picture of where Kenya is at the moment with regards to innovation. So how do we first of all conceptualize innovation? I mean, innovation has been defined. I mean, there are gurus even in this meeting who would tell you ways in which innovation is defined. So the definition of innovation has evolved, over time. And this definition is moving quite rigorously or progressively from the conceptual definition around novelty, a new idea, some of these concepts around inclusivity, to more focus on impact and context alignment, because then an innovation can only be an innovation if it makes sense to the people, if it makes sense to the issues that the people are dealing with. And so in our definition of innovation, you can see that we've defined innovation within this outlook, borrowing from the different framework, including the Oslo guidelines that countries have been using historically to define the innovation as the creation of a new distinct improvement of products and processes in formal and informal settings that have disruptive positive effects on the economy and social well-being. This is a broader definition, but a lot of countries basically are very focused on the economy. When you talk to Kenyan agencies about what they see innovation as, what is most important about innovation, it should be creating jobs, it should be creating money, it should be, but this, as we will see in our indicator, framework, you'll realize that the other elements of outcomes and impacts of innovation, like ecological benefits, social well-being, equity issues, have been left out in some of these discourses. So in terms of looking at an outlook, it is important to consider this. So innovation can be process-oriented, can be product-oriented, can be organizational, oriented, or any other way you'd want to put it within your context. And it can happen in various platforms. It can happen in academia, manufacturing, it can happen in hubs, economic zones, even in communities and in various places. So this is, again, is just to show you that when we talk about the concept of innovation, it can be very, very complex. And so this work also builds on a number of studies that have also tried to showcase how innovation can be looked at. And these studies include a number which have been funded mostly by the DFID, formerly, the FCDO, which is formerly DFID. So at a particular time, I think around 2 years ago, we developed the STI metrics for the African countries. So all the 56 African countries, where we developed the indicators in terms of what is relevant for the different countries. But again, moving forward, we realized that that was too broad, and so there was need to bring it down a bit. So again, last year we worked with the ESTECO, the East African Science and Technology Commission, to develop the indicator set, so database for the partner states, which we did. And again, there were many institutional areas that needs to be strengthened, including capacity. So we did some element of capacity building, supporting ESTECO staff on how to interpret indicators or how to use these particular indicators, because we kind of built them in a web-based form. And again, there's still a lot of work to be done for that process to continue. But now, moving forward, I think the more, as I said, there is more focus on trying to contextualize some of these issues. And this is why now going national and contextualizing these particular indicators at a national level is becoming important, so that countries are able to really associate with them, and decision makers within those countries can understand them, can interpret them, and actually make decisions based on them. And in Kenya, this particular journey basically has had a lot of anchorage or a lot of focus or target on the Vision 2030. Next slide. And therefore, I think if you go to the next slide, we go to the methodology, and I would like to invite one of my team members who undertook the study, Professor Sam Kinyanjui, who will take us through the framework and some of the methods we used to develop the outlook before getting into the outlook itself. Prof, if you're hearing me, you can take it up from here. Thank you so much.
Yes, okay, so thank you, Johannes. My name is Sam Kinyanjui. I'm the head of training and capacity building at the Commonwealth Research Program. I also direct a capacity building initiative called IDEAL, Initiative to Develop African Research Leaders, and hold an associate professorship at Oxford University. So I will just take you quickly through the framework that we use to inform the data collection process, and also analysis. We tried to think about the national innovation in terms of the various actors, relationships, and processes that at the end enable an innovation to move from an idea to a point where it's making an impact. And we can look, there are obviously many lenses through which you can look at a national innovation system. And so what you have represented here is a potential of looking at it, but you're not saying it's the only way of looking at it. For example, one could have a lens where they are focusing a lot more on interactions, or they're focusing a lot more on inputs, or they're focusing a lot more on incentives. The other thing to note on this framework that we have presented is that it's very simplified, because others would have become very complicated to look at. But there are a lot of other arrows that are joining the various actors. But briefly, the green box, if you like, is what we are calling the innovation value chain. And that is where the innovation, the ideas are conceptualized within what we call the innovation platforms. This could be both academic, so within universities and TVETs or research institutions, or it could be within the non-academic platforms such as small and medium enterprise, community organization, innovation hubs, and also private sector research and development departments. Now, those hubs or those platforms, or they produce patents, publications, novel, experimental, or trial products, they will generate novel systems or even novel processes. But for those to then move on to be adopted and scaled up, I can see there's a request to make the slides bigger. I don't know how much bigger we can make them, but on my screen, they're full screen. So as I indicated, these products that come through in themselves do not constitute, they may be innovative, but they don't constitute an innovation in the sense that we are thinking, because they are still not necessarily ready to make an impact. And so we have to look at commercialization and scaling, and there are platforms that focus on or specialize on scaling up innovation, such as innovation accelerators, innovation incubators, special economic zones, and also often the private and public enterprises will take up innovations and try them or experiment them out. And when those systems have passed through, they are then passed on to what we may call the uptake platform. Essentially, it's the market, and the market could be either, and it's important to point out, not every innovation will necessarily be commercializable in the sense of finance, because some of those will have social impact, they'll have business impact, they may have economic impact, health impact, educational impact. And so the uptake platforms may include public institutions, government, parastatals, but they may also include private sector or the general public. And it's during that process of moving the innovation to these platforms that you start seeing the fusion and uptake. And it is important to point out that the uptake, there are a number of determinants of uptake. For example, the social, corporate, and innovation culture in a country. And a good example is we've seen M-Pesa really pick up in Kenya because there's a culture of picking up digital innovations, whereas M-Pesa has not necessarily picked up as well in other countries that actually have very similar socio-economic profiles as Kenya. And you'd have to understand why people there didn't pick up M-Pesa as we did in Kenya. Now, for this innovation chain to work, there has to be certain inputs, or what you may call investments, from the government, but also from the private sector. There'll be infrastructure, funding, human resource, and of course, education is an input in the sense that it's what drives the brains that then drives the innovations. But there are also specific incentives that are provided either by the government, for example, to help the acceleration of the innovation through the value chain. You could think about accelerated licensure, prioritizing local procurement, saying if you innovate things, we will buy locally rather than buying up from abroad, giving tax breaks for innovations and investments, intellectual property protection, and the funding for startups. But it's also important to point out that all these activities are taking place within governance, regulation, policy, and legislative context. And it's again important to take account of how innovation, for example, science and technology, is mainstream within development blueprints, whether it is Vision 2030 or even the more global blueprints such as SDGs. Then there are governance structures that determine or govern how innovation moves across this value chain. There are legal and policy frameworks, there are ethics, regulatory systems and coordination, and there are standards and accreditation. And of course, a country like Kenya or any other country operates within a wider global context. And within that global context, there are also treaties, agreements, and policies that impact on the success of innovation within the country. For example, IPR and trade and treaty agreements of which the country is party to. And finally, also to note that in the same way that there are incentives that help scale up or accelerate innovations, there are also impediments to the success of innovations. For example, cheap imports that outcompete local innovations, costly inputs, which means that it's cheaper to just import things from elsewhere, uncertainty around political risk that may reduce investor confidence. And then there is basically corruption and incompetence within the system. And these are systemic impediments. Yeah, and so what we've done is based on this framework, we have generated indicators around what you're calling domains. I think there's a slide that we've missed, but yeah. And so we then took those indicators through a validation process. And then from the validation process, we ran the indicators and developed a comparative score. So to collect the data, we considered the type of data and the sources of data. There are data that are already archived in reliable, in a reliable manner. For example, if you want to know the country's budget for science, technology, and innovation, you can actually go to Treasury or the Treasury website, or look at the national budget as has been presented, and all these are available. So basically what you need to do is a desktop review, or you want to look at the number of students within the universities. Again, you should be able to find this through looking at the university placement sort of database. Then, and so that there's a lot of data that we're able to obtain just by doing desktop reviews. The second approach we took was a value chain survey, and this is essentially a survey of the platforms that I've mentioned, the innovation platforms and the commercialization and platforms, and also the scaling and uptake platforms. And this basically involved sending questionnaires and having interviews with people who are concerned with these platforms. For example, in the universities, talking to the concerned the directors of research and innovation. And then finally, in order to get a really good and in-depth study of the journey of an innovation from its inception all the way, or conception all the way to impact, we selected a number of case studies where we then went and did a deep dive analysis, including talking to the innovators and looking at the incentives, the impediments, and generally the whole experience across the whole journey. Yeah, so these are the domains and the subdomains. I had already described each of these domains, and then from those domains, we've looked at subdomains. And without going through each of them, just to take an example, if you look at the national and economic and legislative context, as a domain, the subdomains are that we are looking at the mainstreaming of SCI and development blueprints, legal and policy frameworks for innovation in Kenya, government for innovation in structures in Kenya, governance and structures for innovation in Kenya, and the international treaties that relate to innovations to which Kenya is a signatory. And I won't go through all this, but I think you get the idea of how we have developed domains and subdomains. Then essentially, based on those, we have also looked at the global databases that have presented similar indicators, and we ended up with 263 indicators, and these indicators come within each of the subdomains. We then had a stakeholders workshop where we then looked at prioritizing the indicators and also ensuring that they have a local relevance. So we moved from 263 indicators all the way to 77 prioritized indicators for the final report. Next slide, please. Yeah. And so this is an example of a score for the country, and you can look at scores for each of the of the identified indicators, and you can give it a score, and what it produces is a web plot, which you can then use this sort of web plot to compare with other countries, and gives you the profile of Kenya or the Kenya's innovation outlook relative to other countries.
Thank you so much, because we're already into discussing presenting the domains and the indicators that we developed. And in one of the diagrams that has been presented, you've seen that we initially, when we started the study, we went the normal way of looking at the global databases, the global innovation index databases, the various data sets and global studies that have looked at STI more generally. In that context, we tried to build, a number of those which we thought basically were aligned to the global perspective, and that was fine enough at that point, and we produced a report. But when we took these two stakeholders, especially the STI and other stakeholders within Kenya and also the region, the message to us was very strong that one, they wanted a locally led indicators, that they wanted indicators that they could associate with and they could define much more clearly. Of course, some of these global indicators are drawn from the local settings, but there was quite a mismatch in terms of how the stakeholders were expecting, the kind of indicators that the stakeholders were expecting, and the ones we were actually presenting from the global sort of manual. So that also shows you that there is really a gap that needs to be thought about there in terms of how do you bring the wider global expertise, or wider global frameworks to speak to context. And that is a lesson that we learn, and we learned it, relatively in a very hard way. And also the policymaker said, we don't need an academic report, we need a non-academic report. So how do you do this as well? Because again, innovation studies and experts have published widely. There are a lot of great concepts and theories around innovation, but policymakers are demanding that they really need something they can, read and understand better. So that is where now we went into the next step, where we began to work with the stakeholders more and more to develop more locally led indicators, which again are aligned in one way or the other, are aligned to the global processes. While the locally led indicators are context specific, I think one of the key, key limitations or the key gaps is that when you bring stakeholders to begin to identify this indicator, the process can be very subjective, because every stakeholder have their own interpretation of what is important and what works. And I think that is why the framework that we have developed is broad enough in a way that it allows different actors within the innovation space to pick what they think is important for them, to pick what they think is best, they are best in, and run away with it. If there's an agency or an organization which is good in developing startups and commercialization platform, they can pick it, from this framework and run away and do that in a more in-depth way. If there's another organization which is good, they want just to look at the policy context, that can be picked and, be done in a much more in-depth way. And of course, having the framework then allows a particular national agency like Kenya to be able to look at all these actors and the way they sort of implement these different domains that have been described. And I think from here, I want to invite Tom to quickly now take us through some of the indicators that have been identified. So there are indicators and indicator values that we basically have built. But in this presentation, we've basically given a lot of focus on the indicators. What is important to consider in a particular domain of innovation, because then the values have also been used to develop some analysis in terms of what are the frontier indicators, which we can talk about later. Tom, please.
I think this slide has been mentioned, just showing the 6 particular domains which we looked at. So allow me to go straight into each of them. Starting with the first domain, looking at the national and global economic context. And under this particular domain, we have 5 subdomains, looking at the national development blueprints, innovation governance structure, innovation policies, regulatory mechanisms, and international treaties. So under each of the 5 subdomains, we have specific indicators which were prioritized. As have been presented, out of the 172 identified indicators, 77 were prioritized. So what we are showing here are the prioritized indicators under each of the subdomains. So I don't need to read each of them, but under each subdomain, like the national development blueprints, we were looking at the citation of innovations in economic blueprints, like the Vision 2030 that we have nationally, funding allocations to STI agencies, and a number of innovation support programs. So under each of these subdomains, you can see we have the prioritized indicators. But one of the key messages that we can strongly point out at this particular stage is that the presence of dedicated or the governance structure is one of the areas identified and prioritized under this particular domain. So the key messages emerging is that innovation is cited in the national blueprints, yes, and sectoral strategies, but no consolidated visibility, consolidated visibility of innovation agenda. So we have a strong policy environment grounded on the STI Acts 2013 already, and linking to the global, regional, and global policy space. But they are not strong enough. They are strong in the formulation stage, but they're not strongly supporting the commercialization bit of the innovation value chain. Yeah, so you can see that there's a strong identification of the innovation policies as a subdomain where the key messages are being drawn from. So this was one of the areas which was highlighted as most critical to be examined. So if we look at the entire innovation policies, we look at the global, regional, and the local policy space. And nationally, we have the overarching policy, which is the Constitution 2010, supporting some of the innovation policies and strategies that we have. Regionally, we have the Agenda 2063, SDGs, and the Big Four agenda, even if it's a political kind of a blueprint. We are not sure whether the next regime will be taking it up or coming up with the other agendas. But you go down to the sectoral kind of policy. So you find that there's the digital economy blueprint, the TVET's acts and all that, the ICT master plan and all that. So the sectoral kind of policies supporting innovation in different sectors are also in existence. Then you look at this innovation specific kind of policies. We have the STI policies, Industrial Property Act, and all these other, the University Act 2021. All these policies are kind of supporting in one way or the other the innovation domains that we have, or the innovation ecosystem that we are talking about. If you look at the second domain, which is innovation value chain or the life cycle, we have three subdomains. And the three subdomains, the first one is the discovery phase. So we have the knowledge generation subdomain where the innovation knowledge is drawn. And under this, we examined several indicators, of course, looking at the universities, the TVETs, the research institution, and informal kind of knowledge space. Then we have the development and commercialization subdomain, looking at the scaling up according to the framework which was already explained. Then the diffusion and uptake, now taking the innovation to the market level. So we have several indicators under this, and we find that the availability or the development and commercialization bit was highly stressed. It's identified as the main kind of subdomain to look at. And the key insights that are coming out of this is that the good outlook in the discovery phase, with the increasing number of knowledge production platforms, so the number of universities, TVETs, research institutions, and enrollments increasing, and the platforms on development exist but at small scale and highly remain uncoordinated and not properly linked to the development platform. So there's a weak linkage between the knowledge generating platforms and the commercialization platforms, which I can loosely translate to weak linkages between the knowledge producing platforms and the industry out there. So commercialization becomes a frontier subdomain highly ranked by the stakeholders. If you look at the third domain, where we look at the investments, which is one of the inputs, we look at in terms of infrastructures, stroke ICT, but also in terms of funding. And there are a lot of indicators, as you can see, in this particular domain. The national budgetary allocation to the STI is inadequate. That is, that came out clearly. Nevertheless, Kenya enjoys more inward FDI if you compare with other African countries. And more focus of these particular investments are going to the infrastructure, but there's less utilization of these particular infrastructures. So if we look at this particular domain, funding becomes a frontier domain or the key area of focus. And the key insights coming out of this, I think I've mentioned the first one, and the increasing infrastructural investments around digitalization, but we have the need to catalyze utility across sectors. So far, financing or financial investments is a frontier subdomain in this particular domain of investments. If you look at incentives, we have different kind of incentives, and therefore we have the four domains of fiscal incentives, policy incentives, business process incentives, and awards. And under each of those subdomains, we have the indicators that were prioritized. But if we look at in terms of prioritization, we find that the business process incentives is an area or a frontier domain. So incentives exist, but are relatively small scale to spur development of innovation ideas. But the impact of these incentives are unclear and untracked. Incentives on business processes are prioritized, therefore, even more than their word, because of perceived wider impact. So business process incentives are what are prioritized under this particular domain. If you look at the fifth domain, which is on impacts, we have the 4 domains where we look at the social impacts, the economic impacts, political impact, and environmental impact. Under each, we have the prioritized domains. And economic impact is the becomes the frontier kind of subdomain, where no clear framework to track impacts of particular innovations. So innovations have different ways of defining the impact. So if you look at the economic impact, people are keen, or stakeholders are keen on this particular subdomain, but we have no clear framework to track the impacts of this particular domain. Economic impacts are ranked highly, and therefore is a subdomain. I think I've mentioned that. Ecological impacts such as carbon footprints are globally recognized, but are yet to be prioritized in the domestic efforts. So I think that is also an area to kind of look at. The last domain, which is the impediments to innovation, have 3 subdomains: structural inefficiencies, economic barriers, and cultural barriers. We have the prioritized indicators under these. The structural inefficiency barriers or impediments become a frontier domain, even more than the cultural barriers. So I think this is what we need to deal with in terms of addressing the barriers. At this point, I think I'll invite you back, Dr. Johannes, to take it up on the frontier domains.
Thank you, Tom. I think you've already highlighted some of these frontier domains, but I just want to emphasize one fact that, as you have seen, the innovation outlook or system is relatively complex. It is something that perhaps no one agency or no one kind of actor can really tackle all those particular domains and get data and present them much more effectively. But nonetheless, the frontier domain subdomains are some of the areas that came out to be very important, to be catalytic. So some of these areas provide some pointers to where investments or effort, or Kenya as a country could make some efforts in terms of enhancing its innovation outlook. And as Thomas mentioned, number one, the first part is the innovation policy. And what comes out there clearly is the lack of proper consolidated policy agenda. While different development plans are actually mentioning innovation as key to their progress, there is no consolidated innovation agenda that then can profile what kinds of innovation can be done, or a master plan that basically leverages on innovation. For instance, if you look at the blueprints, they talk about innovation being a key pillar to the development. But if you look at the economic outlook, the Kenya economic outlook that is always being produced by, I think it is Kipra, you realize that there is really very little mention of innovation. So where is the connection between innovation being, an economic driver or a part of, the policy process? So that is also a question of, lack of that consolidation in terms of the policy messaging around innovation, but also governance issues around different ministries and sectors in interpreting innovation differently. In the second domain around the value chain, I think commercialization has come out very clearly, and this is an area that I think has been, mentioned quite in many publications and engagement. That how can, for instance, some of the research or innovation ideas that come up be commercialized? So from the academic platforms, it's always a challenge because again, translating a number of the huge amount of research that happens into some impactful aspects has been an issue. And this perhaps is linked to some of the concerns by African governments around the hesitancy to invest in research and development, because then that link between research and how it contributes to development is still really very weak. Even though there are efforts around the technology transfer offices in a number of universities, these units or these efforts or sort of units or transfer offices are relatively weak in terms of capacity or in terms of really linking to the outside market environment. And so you realize that what we found is that the connection between when we talked to some of the commercialization platforms like startups and asked them where they get their ideas, which they commercialize, a lot of them get the ideas from the market out there, but really very few said they are actually drawing ideas from the universities or academic platforms. So the linkage between the universities and enterprise development is a major concern, and perhaps thinking about some frameworks that could catalyze that particular linkage to be able to build what I would call entrepreneurial universities. I think Kenya, we are already doing some project with Kenya, where we are trying to look at how can universities be made more entrepreneurial, how can they be connected better to enterprises. Of course, funding remains a major frontier, especially in the investment domain. In this case, I think I've talked about the need to enhance funding, especially for startups. But even as we enhance funding for these emerging innovations, there's need to connect them better to the innovation producing ideas. Otherwise, that mismatch may render funding ineffective. And of course, business process incentives have wider impacts, and economic impacts are very critical in terms of the way the narrative is set now. Indeed, we need to bring in some other elements of social and ecological aspects in terms of how we look at innovation and economic, innovation impacts. The dominant narrative is about innovation and economic, and that's why we talk about entrepreneurship. Even ourselves, we talk about startups, but little do we talk about how is innovation gender sensitive. How are the innovation funds addressing equity issues? And I think these are some of the critical points that have been raised by different stakeholders, and an outlook in this nature can help us to begin broadening our thinking around innovation away from the narrow way that we've always looked at it as a line that product, market, money. Of course, there are structural inefficiencies, things to do with corruption and of course incompetencies, which results into a lot of piracy and counterfeits, which again become a challenge or sort of discourages innovation. And so we have built a scoreboard, a kind of an online based on those particular indicators. And this particular scoreboard is an online kind of interactive platform that allows these indicators to be visualized and be updated using values data that is available. So the idea is to provide a platform to Kenya and of course other government agencies to be able to begin updating the progress of the country's outlook, and in doing so, then some of those particular justifications or rationales that I mentioned earlier could be achieved. And I want to invite briefly in 3 minutes as we end this presentation, Aaron, to just show us a bit of this particular framework, this platform, how it looks like and how it will function. 3 minutes, please, Aaron.
Thank you so much, Dr. Johannes, and I'll just take it from there. I think I'll not repeat what my colleagues have said, but after developing the indicators, we decided to, we asked ourselves a question, who is the consumer of this information? And we realized that, yes, we have this information and we have developed some of these indicators which are really good, but now how are we going to share it to the public domain? So we came up with this, the Kenyan Innovation STI dashboard, where we have all the indicators. So under this, we have two subdomain. We have the dashboard and then we have the scoreboard. So under the scoreboard here, we have all the been able to digitize all the indicators that that have been presented earlier, and you can see we managed to show which domain is under which domain, and then the subdomain of the domain one. We have the subdomain, and then the number of indicators that have been identified under that subdomain. So what we are doing at the moment now is converting this one into a readable format. For example, the enrollment, in terms of the enrollment from 2019 to 2020 to 2021. So when you click on one indicator, you'll be able to see the trend. So this is now the next thing that we are still working on, to make sure that and this information is being populated in an online platform, and it's being able to be shared widely, both in Kenya and also to the wider stakeholder, so that they may be able also to link this the indicator with the trend at the moment. And also, I think they'll also echo what Johannes has said, that it depends. It also, based on the indicator, we might even think of having a wide comprehensive national outlook survey, which will link. We might say, okay, we want to do the subdomain under the domain and the subdomain. So what we'll be able to do, that we link that data that have been collected in the field and link it to the subdomain, and be able to see the visualization of what we have been able to collect, and able to see the trend. So this one will be shown in the dashboard here, where we'll be able to say, for example, if such information was filled by Egerton University or Nairobi University, when you click on the domain, you'll be able to see the trend, and then you'll be able to scale it down to that specific. For example, look at the university, and then now you'll be able to click that specific university that, for example, that specific university want to see the trend. So that's now the next step that we are doing. So we'll be able to finalize this one. It's still in the progress, and we'll be able to finalize this one. And however, the link is available, and we'll be able to share that. Thanks. Back to you, Dr. Johannes.
Thank you, Aaron. And then in conclusion, just to go back, I don't know whether you share the slides, Tom, from your end. And so we can conclude with the final slide. I just want to highlight that these slides will be shared together with the final report, which has a lot of other details that are useful. Okay, so we've talked about that digital scoreboard, and so we have our conclusion. And key things to note about this study, and I've seen a number of comments also aligned to this conclusion, is that this outlook provides a foundational framework upon which Kenya's innovation assessment can be drawn. As I've said, different actors can run away with different components, but now in a more coordinated way, in a way that they can report back. Overall, Kenya's innovation outlook is relatively complex and still requires a better coordination and consolidation. I think there's a comment already to that particular effect. And of course, one thing to stress is that the study has basically succeeded in working with stakeholders to develop an inaugural contextual framework and indicators which Kenyan decision makers and stakeholders can relate with and apply in tracking innovation progress. So this is very key for us to mention. In terms of some of the possible next steps is basically to go into in-depth analysis of some of these indicators, go into sectoral analysis, even at the subnational level, because we know county governments are also becoming important platforms for innovation that needs to be looked into. And there are a number of ways we can also link this particular work to some of the ongoing initiatives, like the Innovation Bridge initiative that is being led by Kenya, but most importantly, future outlooks might focus on, Kenya can decide, depending on how this goes, you can decide that in our future outlook, we look at commercialization in 2023 outlook, or we look at startups, or we look at the knowledge producing platform and drill deep to provide that outlook and get that presented, or decide to do everything across all the domains. But what this study has provided is that menu for stakeholders to take and do what they are best at doing, but in a more coordinated and a more structured way. Next slide, which should be the final one, is basically to, we had a couple of recommendations that we've shared in the document that shared with you. But yeah, you can have a look at that. But then we also share the report to see the recommendation. Just to thank the study team, which has really worked in bringing this study to where it is. Next slide. And also, I mentioned that there were expert reviewers who supported this work with expert review. We have Joe Shataway, who has worked quite comprehensively in the context, and Andy Frost, who also has done quite some work on knowledge systems, working with some of us to build that. We have our own Dr. Eli Osir, who provided some really also good insights in this particular process. And we want to thank them for their relentless efforts in terms of building this, the innovation or the STI landscape for the continent. And of course, we had a national working group, which basically provided feedback at various points of the outlook and guided the process. The names are there, and we are thankful to them. And finally, just to acknowledge, of course, FCDO for supporting this work. And we hope that we can actually invest more to get more detailed and strategic outcomes or results from some of those strategic frontier areas that have been identified. And I want to say thank you so much for listening. If you go to the next slide, and you'll find an email, my email is there. I will share these slides and we can discuss further on any other questions. Thank you so much. I want to give it to Nora, who is going to moderate for us the discussions from here.
Thanks, everyone. Study team that has taken us through comprehensively around what the study was all about. And just to mention that we've provided, the highlights, and a lot of detailed is in the report. But right now, it would be great if we could just take up the questions. I've seen a number of questions in the chat, although it would also be great if we have a few of us maybe use the, you could raise your hands under the reaction, or also just feel free if you want to jump in. So maybe as you do that, I have one of the questions that was posted by George Moneki around impact and why we considered this as one of the domain. And of course, your recommendation is that it would be good to look at the barriers to spurring innovation, but around the bottlenecks, converting innovation from universities to viable businesses. And I think one of the subdomains or one of the highlights that came out is actually strengthening the routes to commercialization. Particularly when you look at academic platforms as knowledge generators, or at the discovery phase of the innovation. So it would be good to strengthen that arm so that you enhance or you support more routes to commercialization. And I think reflecting on your question, why impact maybe should have been considered in all the subdomains is because perhaps the reason we thought that could be a standalone area is because when you look at innovation or any investments, whether in R&D, research and innovation for development, or in innovation, so there's usually they're expected to deliver something. And of course, these are broad impacts when it comes to social impact, economic impacts, environmental, and we did not, have a particular outcome in mind, but we just wanted to broaden that out and see what is it that can be measured in the short term and in the long term. And of course, not everything will be attributed to certain inputs. So what we used here are case studies to try and document what do these case studies tell us about a certain impact? But certainly this is, as has been highlighted, I think this is a work in progress, and perhaps subsequent outlooks could consider impact at every domain. So that's a very good feedback for our own consideration. So I'll just read the other comments, and maybe anyone from the study team will feel free to jump in. The second, I think, is a comment from Professor Mugabe, John Mugabe, that we need to have a clear outlook of the Kenya National Systems of Innovation, or Kenya Innovation Systems, and later worry about outlooks of innovation activities and outputs in the country. The quality of the national systems of innovation determines the country's innovation performance, which I quite agree. And maybe, do you just want to perhaps reflect on that comment? Because I know a couple of, innovation, documentation of the Kenya National Innovation Systems. And of course, we've seen this structure that has been presented over and over again, looking at the SD&I, the demand side, the framework systems, giving the business ecosystem, education and research, governance. So, and I think a couple of initiatives or studies have tried to give this. So I don't know if you just want to reflect a bit, Professor Mugabe, then we continue with the comments.
Thank you, Nora, and thank you to the team for the great work. My comment is actually more about the quality of the system itself, as opposed to mapping activities and outputs from various interventions in the system. What I've seen many times are attempts to map actors and activities in the system, but we don't get to really get in analysis of the quality of the policies, innovation policies, the quality of institutions, the quality of governance of the system. And what I'm proposing is maybe that's where we should focus a bit more on in future in terms of improving the policy, governance, and institutions. I appreciate the need to have outlooks on different facets of innovation. And a lot of that is being done, by the way, the Global Innovation Index that has been referred to, the African Innovation Outlook, and many other outlook reports. But maybe what we need to do is put our focus on how we improve the system. Today, South Africa launched its STI policy indicators report, and the same issue comes up. The efficiency of the system. It's not so much about the investments and outputs, but how do you improve the performance of the system? And that's very, very tricky. Reflecting on the definition of the national system of innovation that is provided, the quality of these interactions between private and public sector. How do you measure those interactions? What are the outcomes of those interactions? So, Nora, what I'm suggesting is maybe in terms of future outlooks, you could design one which is focused more on the system.
Thank you very much, Professor Mugabe. And you've raised some very legitimate and pertinent points around the fact that the success of the innovation system is very dependent on the performance of the sort of policy space and the incentive space and all that. And we are very much aware in cognizance of the fact that we have not done a really good in-depth analysis, policy analysis, performance analysis. And at this point, part of that was just a time issue, but the other part was a recognition that each of the domains then now require quite a bit of resources to go into index. So it's not for lack of appreciation of what you have raised. It's a bit more to do with just first setting. We're thinking of this particular outlook as kind of laying the foundation, and we have had these discussions, FCDO and Kenya and others, that they will be need to then start taking each of the domains and doing some really more in-depth and deep dive analysis and studies around them. So thank you very much for reinforcing that point.
So we had, I don't know, George, I just read your comment, but I don't know whether you wanted to just reflect a bit on it. And then, we go to Patrick. So as George prepares, that was, I think, Dr. George Mwaniki. So Patrick, you wanted to know how Kenya compares with the rest of the countries when it comes to the enabling environment. I don't know whether Tom or Johannes wants to take this question. And of course, to what extent we did comparison when it comes to Kenya, Tanzania, you know, generally East Africa when it comes to aspects of commercialization. Anyone from the team?
I could take that quickly. This information is also, you'll find it in the report, because we've done for each of the frontier indicator, we've done some comparative ranking with the, first of all, with the other African country within Africa, but also globally. But also we've tried to compare some of the best performing countries in the world with regard to some of these domains, and to see what is it that they're doing very well. Like if you look at Mauritius, is currently, according to the recent index, Mauritius is ranked kind of top of Africa when it comes to innovation. So we went and looked into what Mauritius has done, and what we came out is that Mauritius has actually liberalized its governance structure and invested a lot in partnership. So while the Kenyan case, we found that a lot of, yes, there's a lot of policies and government agencies, but they are relatively sort of regulatory in nature. They are more focused on the regulation rather than facilitation. So breaking that gap where you begin to have more facilitative policies that enable quicker commercialization, quicker establishment of businesses, incentives that can support those particular processes, policies that enable PPPs and different forms of partnerships are important in terms of catalyzing innovation. So there is need to focus on that element. And if you compare Kenya and other African countries, yes, Kenya performs relatively moderate with regards to was it commercialization or something, or with regards to, was it with regards to impediments or what? What was the area that was asked, if I may get it? Nora, what was the indicator?
It was just with regards to commercialization, just broadly in terms of the enabling environment.
Enabling environment for commercialization, yeah. Okay. Yeah. I think the performance is relatively moderate. Kenya is in the top 10, I think, especially with regards to patents that have come from the universities, then are on their way to being kind of commercialized products. But the major challenge has to do with the IP policy. There's a huge challenge with Kenya's IP policy, which I think is not properly reinforced, and also is not kind of well embedded within the different platforms, the academic platforms, but also the commercialization platforms. Like when we were talking to the TTOs, there was really very limited awareness among researchers about some of these, IP policies. How do you protect, the patents? How do you patent? How do you register? so that the research that comes out can be actually commercialized. But much of the details are in the report. Thanks.
All right, then we go to almost like the last question. So we have Terry Gizinji from Fingo. Would you just like to unmute and maybe raise this, the way you thought about it as you posted it? Terry?
Right. Thank you. No, I was just keen to find out from the study of the research if how much involvement was done in the NGO sector, the development sector, because there's a lot of innovation that's happening there. You find, like, I'd say, like in Fingo Power Bank, we do support experiments at community level, experiments of our NGOs to, you know, have innovations within their program work. And of course, there's very little tracking of that, but we've seen traction with those experiments and some of them have been scaled out. So I just wanted to know if your research had some questions or targeted NGOs and development players as stakeholders.
Yeah, thanks, Terry. Yeah, so in terms of the whole stakeholder consultation process, yes, we had you know, informants from NGOs, but also we had a number of case studies that were done, and part of them are case studies from different domain areas, and more particularly when it comes to you know, innovation hubs and how they support commercialization or support entrepreneurs. So we had a number of case studies that were selected. And Tom, maybe you just want to provide a bit of reflection around that, how we selected and scoped out, and perhaps you know, the kind of questions that were targeted in terms of documenting these case studies.
Yeah, thanks, Nora. I think you have mentioned it already. Yeah, the NGOs, I can say that they were involved, but the main framework that was developed and used for this particular study targeted the domains. So when looking at each domains, we mapped the different players. For example, in the value chain domain, the knowledge platforms, the scaling up, and the diffusions, at least we got different representation. And again, at the case study stage, we had different players, of course. Then lastly, I think in the stakeholder kind of engagements, apart from the key informants in data collection and yeah, the validation process and consultations, a number of NGOs and yeah, players were involved. So I don't want to go much more into the specifics because I don't have all the details here. Yeah.
All right. Yeah. Thank you very much. So I'll just request another couple of minutes. I know we're 2 minutes into finishing this, but I just wanted to perhaps let other members of the working group who are here, perhaps if they have some reflections or feedback. All right, so before I go that, I've seen Josephine Dambuki's hand from Konza Technopolis. Maybe Josephine, you could ask your question, and then would have Mr. Joshua Nyakundi and perhaps Dr. Chaone to give us their reflections as part of the working group. Yes, go ahead, Josephine.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. First, I want to appreciate this session and the good work that has been done. Looked at the report, it's quite comprehensive based on the highlights that were shared. My comment is actually, and the question is around the commercialization of innovation. And just reflecting on the fact that you've noted there's a gap between research and commercialization, which is the universities and the industry. And just looking at the role of spaces, commercializing spaces and the nexus that in government we have different agencies that could support commercialization of research. I'm just thinking, in your research, did you identify this? And I think from our side, one of the possible gaps we see is partnerships towards commercialization on all these actors. So did that come across? Expected to see a recommendation based out of that? And the second one is, so going forward, how do we activate or implement the report? What are some of the things that would be picked up? Is the future going to focus on implementing some of the recommendations so that then we see how the next step looks like and how we can participate in that phase? Thank you.
Yeah, I think the couple of questions for us. One of the things, whether we saw a partnership as a key role when it comes to commercialization, I think yes. This is because we identified a number of, I could say, places. So at the universities, we have these technology transfer units, and we feel that perhaps strengthening them would be a key, area when you want to commercialize. Perhaps supporting them when it comes to training. And I know Kenya has done a lot of work when it comes to having these offices and deploying staff, including training modules when it comes to supporting the universities. So there is possibilities to support more partnerships, collaboration across these technology transfer units. And one of the areas, and another gap is actually when it comes to the TVETs, and where also a lot of innovation activities happen. So perhaps facilitating some of these partnerships would be great. So I don't know if Professor Kinyanjui wants to talk through a few of the questions that Josephine has raised. How do we activate, implement, and what does the future outlook look like? Professor?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously one of the key partners in this process has been Kenya, who have been specifically mandated by the 2013 Act of Parliament, FCDO Act, to push and promote commercialization and marketing. We also have other agencies, as you have rightly pointed out. In fact, I think we didn't show that particular slide, but there are a number of agencies within the Ministry of Industrialization, Trade and Enterprise, within the Ministry of Education, within the Ministry of Health, obviously Health Research and Health Technology, within the Ministry of ICT Innovation and New Affairs, and also within the Ministry of Agriculture for Agriculture Innovations. And so we will be then engaging with all these agencies and with obviously the leadership of Kenya in particular to make sure that they, or at least to try and push through the recommendations that we are going to generate from this report. The other thing, as particularly Professor Mugabe had indicated, it's not necessarily that there's an absence of the sort of frameworks that should be pushing them. It's more about performance, and therefore we would be again working with different stakeholders across the whole of the innovation space to try and really get the government to walk the talk, essentially, if I may put it that way. So yes, you're right, there are many different agencies that we must engage with to try and get the recommendations implemented.
All right, then Dr. Chaone?
I had the opportunity to go through the reports, and I also submitted some specific comments. But I think the questions that have been raised so far, I great questions that we should really reflect on. And I think the point that I would want to comment on is what Professor Mugabe pointed out, that we need a clear outlook of Kenya's national system of innovation. And my thinking is that deliberations like this one, starting with this report, is actually a very good starting point, because the context within which most measurements are actually done, be they measurements that are done at the Global Innovation Index level or at the level of the African Innovation Outlook, we have not sufficiently interrogated the context within which innovation takes place in the countries that we measure innovation. But I would want to comment on one thing that we seem to think it's obvious or it's implied. Still with reference to what Professor Mugabe indicated, that we need to have a clear outlook of Kenya's national system of innovation that is comprised of different components. And within those components, we have elements that relate to the domains that this document also talk about. All of these, they generate a lot of data. A lot of data is generated. So sometimes we work with insufficient and poor quality data, hoping to get insights that are high quality. It doesn't work like that. If you are working with poor quality data, you get poor quality insights, and you end up getting poor decisions that you pass on. So after reading this document and submitting my comments, I think there are areas that I think we should always keep in sight while we are doing this wonderful work. Issues like business registers, issues like the statistical potential that one gets from using administrative records, issues like data infrastructure within the different NSI components. We also need to improve data infrastructure at different levels. And we need to keep in mind that governments, including local government and various agencies, they provide services to people and to business, and they also define boundaries. How efficient are all these components in support of innovation? Madam Moderator, I can talk the whole day, but I really would want to say the efforts that Kenya is taking are worthwhile efforts in having a constant interrogation of our national system of innovation. We are not claiming, even in this document, that we have an adequate understanding of Kenya's NSI, but we are saying for us to deepen our understanding, these are some of the things that we need to do. That is the message that I'm getting from this initial study. And with iterative studies, our expectation is that we will get to deepen our understanding of Kenya's national system of innovation and then its performance, and have a systemic view that would at a later stage include innovation performance in different counties of Kenya's system of government. I think these are my initial impressions, Madam Moderator. Thank you so much.
All right, yeah, thank you. So I don't know whether Mr. Nyakundi is still here. If not, then I just want to thank all of you for your reflections, your questions, and comments on the chat. And perhaps give it back, because we have 5 more minutes, to Dr. Johannes for him to let us know in terms of next steps and close this workshop. Back to you.
Thank you, Nora. I think we have said many things, and I just want to appreciate some of the comments that have been made by the different participants. As we all agree, this is work in progress, but I think the goal we begin to score here as a community that is focusing on supporting or transforming innovation or STI in this country is that we are beginning to talk to our context. However much it might not be perfect or it might be perfect, we are all agreeing that we are beginning to talk to our context. We are beginning to, bring down the bigger concepts of STI into, the space where it needs to be in terms of being actioned on. And of course, we are also beginning to build a massive capacities, because this field of STI and innovation has been actually been relatively expert-based field, where we've had a number of great experts who have really developed a lot of great ideas, people like John Mugabe here, my great mentor, Professor Kalishas Jumali, developed great, ideas, and of course, a number of other global impacts, experts who are developing great ideas on STI. But the gap has been on how we bring this home. And therefore, I think this is a journey that is very important. And we are actually trying to also bring a mass of thinkers who can start thinking contextually while aligning globally. So when I see some of these young fellows who are able to articulate indicators, the Toms, Noras, and everybody who is coming up to passionately pursue some of these things, I think Africa, we are in a good place, because then the wisdom that the Mugabes have had can be passed on in a very strategic way and in a very impactful way. So I'm really very grateful for this process, and I do hope that we can continue with the engagement and to ensure that we get at least 1 or 2 or 3 things right, even if we don't get everything right. And of course, in line with the dreams and the aspirations of the Africa Agenda 2063, our common future. So I want to say thank you to everybody for the time. The next steps will involve finalizing the report, incorporating some of the comments that have been made. I must say that it won't be possible to incorporate all the comments that have been made, but some of these comments are going to be very instrumental as becoming part of the recommendations for making more interventions into the studies. So once we revise the report, we'll send the report to everybody who has participated here and those who have not also been able to participate, because we want this message to go out there. We'll also send the presentation plus other briefing information that could be useful for the different stakeholders pursuing this. So on behalf of the ARIN network, the Kenya Innovation Agency, I've just been speaking to the CEO, who has actually sent his apologies, but he's very much supportive of the process, and he has been really very supportive of innovation processes in Kenya and making it a model for Africa. So we want to say thank you, and may God bless you as we hope to again engage next